I wonder what it would be like to place your hand in Jesus' side, to take your fingers and touch the wounds of Christ. I often wonder about St. Thomas and his infamous doubt. I wonder if it came from a struggle with the weakness of Jesus, the woundedness of Jesus. Perhaps St. Thomas had a difficulty dealing with his own weakness. One of the questions that arises in my heart on this Sunday, as with these readings, is what's it like for us to allow Jesus to touch our wounds? To allow Jesus to place his hands upon our weakness. You know, when I was out of college and was going through a conversion process, it was a conversion process that took a long time. And at a certain point, I really decided I was going to try to live a good life, try to be holy. And it seemed like the harder that I tried, the further that I fell. The more I tried to avoid sin, the more I seemed to fall into it. It became very frustrating, very difficult, very painful. And I began to look back on my past and all the sinful things that I had done, all the people that I'd hurt, all the people that I had helped to fall into sin and give themselves over to sin. And my heart became like an open wound. It's almost like there was a corkscrew in my heart or something. It was at that time when Father Jay Jackson was here, and so I'd gotten to know Father Jay pretty well, and so I went to talk to him about this. This is maybe one of the first times that I had ever really laid out this wound that was festering in my heart to anyone. And he and I were talking, and I don't remember what he was actually saying. I just remember that at a certain moment, all of a sudden, it felt like someone had a hold of my heart. I had a physical sensation of someone grabbing my heart and massaging it. And I've only experienced something like that twice in my life. But I knew in that instant that it was Jesus that had a hold of my heart and who was massaging my heart and healing it. And I looked up startled at Father Jay to say, do you realize what's happening here? And I could tell from his expression that he didn't really know or realize what was going on inside of me. And I never said anything. We just kept talking, but I was utterly, completely overwhelmed at God's mercy as he touched and grabbed hold of my wounded heart and brought healing there. It was actually the next night when Father Jay was murdered. You know, it's that sense of the healing that I received, and yet carrying this kind of woundedness that I bring each day to the Lord. And that when I'm ministering in God's name, that I carry that sense of God's desire to heal us of our woundedness, to meet us right there at our most broken places. That God, especially to those who are sick and suffering, calls each of us to be his merciful hands. All of you, probably almost every person here, has had an experience of having our wounds healed. And often it's through another person, the kindness or the love of another person. Let's look again at this scene from the Gospel of John with St. Thomas. After Jesus had suffered horrifically and died on the cross, they gathered in this upper room and they locked the doors out of fear. And the resurrected Jesus came and stood before them. The first words that he speaks are this: "Peace be with you." He even repeats it. Peace be with you. The very first gift of the resurrected Lord is his peace. And then next it says, he showed them his hands and his side. He showed them his wounds, the wounds of love, the wounds that reveal the very weakness of God. But St. Thomas wasn't there. And I've often wondered why he was not. I mean, maybe St. Thomas, he had an abundance of courage. Maybe he was even fearless, and he wasn't going to lock himself behind these doors. Maybe the disciples in their fear and in their weakness repulsed him. He couldn't stand it. He wasn't going to cower behind the doors. You remember earlier in St. John's Gospel, when Jesus was going to Bethany after Lazarus had died, St. Thomas boldly proclaimed, "Let us go also to die with him." I don't think there was a lack of courage in St. Thomas, but I think his struggle, perhaps his difficulty, was in seeing Jesus' weakness, was seeing the weakness in the other disciples. And so therefore, what was hard for him was to confront his own weakness. You know, a lot of times when we've been wounded or we've been hurt, we expend a monumental amount of effort to not let anyone near that woundedness or that hurt, that weakness. We spend so much time making sure no one can see our pain, our weakness, our vulnerability. You know, it'd probably been easier for St. Thomas if he'd have died with Jesus. Far easier than having to see Jesus suffer, to see his weakness. And so what does Jesus do? He appears to Thomas and he goes, "Here's my wounds, Thomas. Put your hand in my side. Touch these wounds." Jesus wants to ask Thomas, how weak and wounded are you, really? Are we weak enough to meet people in their weakness? Are we willing to be vulnerable enough to allow others to touch us in our woundedness? You know, St. Thomas became One of the great apostles, the story is that he took the gospel to Syria and even to India. You know, when the Europeans showed up in India in the 1500s to bring the gospel there, they found groups of Christians in India. And they asked them, where did you get your faith from? And they said, well, we're St. Thomas Christians, is what they called themselves. So do we have the courage to trust Jesus' mercy, to allow him to come and touch our weakness and our woundedness, to seek refuge always in the wounds of his love? On this Divine Mercy Sunday, the only way that we can truly be merciful to others is if we have first received that merciful, tender love of God. For the one who is truly merciful, the one who has mercy, suffering and weakness are not repulsive, but they actually draw us. The one who has mercy seeks out misery in order to give his heart to the wretched, seeks out those who are suffering, who are sick, who are weak, who are marginalized. Pope Francis tells us that the name of God is mercy. On this Sunday of Divine Mercy, we ask God to help us to allow him to touch us in our deepest brokenness, to touch our wounds, to bring us his mercy there, so that we in turn might be merciful to one another.